The table went quiet, not because I spoke up, but because I finally stopped correcting them. You want to know what that silence felt like? It felt like holding your breath underwater until your lungs scream, then finally breaking the surface. Except I'd been drowning for 28 years, and they never even noticed I was struggling. This isn't about jealousy. This isn't about sibling rivalry or petty family drama. This is about how a family can decide who matters without ever asking a single question. How they can write your story before you even know you have one. How they can love you and erase you at the same time, with such casual efficiency that you start to wonder if you were ever really there at all. Family gatherings run on assumptions, always have. My parents assume Emma will light up the room because she always has. Emma assumes everyone wants to hear about her latest adventure because they always do. Everyone assumes I'm proud of my brilliant, beautiful sister because what else would I be? And I used to assume that if I just explained myself clearly enough, if I just corrected the record often enough, someone would eventually listen. But explaining yourself to people who've already decided who you are is like trying to convince someone they're dreaming while they're still asleep. They'll nod and smile and go right back to the dream they prefer. I learned this early, maybe too early. When Emma got into Princeton, the celebration lasted 3 days. When I graduated summa cum laude from medical school, they remembered to call 2 weeks later. When Emma bought her first apartment, Dad helped her move and took photos of every room. When I bought mine, a better one in a better neighborhood, with money I earned myself, Mom asked if I was sure I could afford the mortgage. The pattern was so consistent, it became invisible. Like background noise you don't notice until it stops. So what happens when people stop asking questions and you stop volunteering answers? You become a ghost at your own family dinner. You become a supporting character in conversations about your own life. You become so tired of defending your existence that you start to question if it's worth defending at all. Emma's engagement party was supposed to be intimate. 40 people crammed into my parents' living room, string lights draped over family photos, champagne glasses catching the light like tiny mirrors, reflecting the same golden moment over and over. The kind of gathering where everyone knows their role before they walk through the door. I was assigned mine the moment I arrived, not by anyone saying anything directly. That would have been too honest. Instead, it was the way Dad immediately handed me a stack of coats. The way Mom steered me toward the kitchen with a gentle but firm hand on my back. The way Emma's future mother-in-law smiled at me with that particular brand of politeness reserved for the help. Emma's sister is so helpful, I heard her say to someone behind me. Not my name, not my profession, not even my personality, just my function in relation to the star of the show. I could have corrected her. I should have corrected her. The old me would have found a way to work my job into the conversation, to mention my research, to make myself visible through sheer force of will. But I was tired, bone-deep, soul-crushing tired, of being my own publicist at every family function. So I hung up the coats and smiled and let them reduce me to whatever made them comfortable. The fiancé, David, stood near the fireplace with a cluster of Emma's college friends, all of them laughing at something she'd said. He had the look of someone trying to keep up with a conversation that moved too fast, nodding at the right moments but always a beat behind. I recognized the expression. It was the same one I wore at these things, except I'd perfected it over decades. But while everyone else was watching Emma perform, and make no mistake, she was performing, she always was, David kept glancing around the room. His eyes would catch on details, linger on faces, pause on conversations happening in the margins. The kind of attention that most people never learn to pay. When his gaze landed on me, I expected it to slide past the way everyone else's did. Instead, he held it for a moment. Not staring, not rude, just acknowledging, like he was actually seeing me instead of seeing through me. It should have felt good. It didn't. It felt dangerous. Because the last thing I needed was someone else figuring out what my own family had spent decades missing. The last thing I needed was a witness to how invisible I'd become in my own life. The laughter from Emma's circle grew louder. Someone had asked about the proposal story again, and she was retelling it with the kind of animated detail that suggested this wasn't the first time tonight. Her hands moved like she was conducting an orchestra, her voice rising and falling with practiced timing. Everyone leaned in, even though they'd probably heard this story at least twice already. So there I was, thinking we were just going for a walk in Central Park, Emma said, her engagement ring catching the light as she gestured. I had no idea he'd hired a photographer to hide in the bushes. Can you imagine? David, you're such a romantic. David smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The kind that said he was thinking about something else entirely. Tell them about the ring, Mom called out from across the room. Tell them how he designed it himself. More cooing, more exclamations, more questions about carats and settings, and when they'd start planning the wedding. I watched from the kitchen doorway, holding a tray of appetizers I'd been asked to pass around, feeling like a caterer at my own family's celebration. That's when David broke away from the group. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, just a quiet extraction from the orbit of Emma's storytelling. He moved toward the kitchen with purpose, like he was looking for something specific, or someone. "You're Emma's sister," he said when he reached me. Not a question, not an introduction, just a statement hanging in the air between us. I waited for the rest of it. The polite inquiry about what I did for work, the casual assumption that I was married or single or living with my parents, the inevitable comparison to Emma that would reveal exactly how much he'd already been told about the family dynamics. Instead, he said something that made my entire world shift on its axis. "Dr. Chen, right? From Mount Sinai?" The tray nearly slipped from my hands. Not because he knew my name, though that was shocking enough, but because of the way he said it. Like my title meant something, like my work meant something, like I meant something. "You know who I am?" "I should. You saved my father's life." The words hit me like ice water. Suddenly, the familiar expression, the way he'd been watching me, the careful attention he paid to conversations, it all clicked into place. "Robert Morrison," I said, the memory rushing back. Triple bypass, complications with the anesthesia, we had to reopen twice. "That's right." His voice was quiet, almost reverent. "You stayed with him for 14 hours. You wouldn't let the other surgeons take over, even when your shift ended. Even when everyone else said there wasn't anything more you could do." I remembered that night. The way Robert Morrison's vitals kept dropping. The way every decision felt like threading a needle in an earthquake. The way I'd refused to leave the OR because leaving felt like giving up. and giving up felt like murder. I also remembered the way my family had reacted when I told them about it later. Emma had changed the subject to her latest photography project. Dad had made a joke about how doctors probably got paid overtime for those kinds of hours. Mom had worried that I wasn't getting enough sleep. No one had asked about the patient. No one had asked how I felt carrying someone's life in my hands for 14 hours. No one had asked anything at all. He talked about you, David continued, for months after the surgery. Said you were the best surgeon he'd ever met. Said you had hands like an artist and the focus of a machine. The compliment should have felt good. It didn't. It felt like a knife, twisting in a wound I'd forgotten was still open. Because this stranger, this man who was about to marry into my family, knew more about my work, understood more about who I was than the people who'd known me my entire life. He'd heard stories about my skill, my dedication, my character, while my own parents still introduced me as Emma's sister at neighborhood barbecues. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "I tried to find you after the surgery, but the hospital said you don't usually meet with families afterward." "I don't." "Why not?" It was such a simple question, such an obvious question, the kind of question my family had never thought to ask. Why didn't I want recognition? Why didn't I seek out gratitude? Why did I disappear into the background of my own accomplishments? Because recognition meant expectations. Because gratitude meant vulnerability. Because staying invisible meant staying safe from the kind of disappointment that comes when people finally see you clearly and decide you're not worth the effort after all. But I couldn't say any of that to David. Not here, not now, not with Emma's laughter echoing from the next room like a soundtrack to everything I'd never be. "It's just easier," I said instead. He nodded like he understood, but his eyes said he saw right through the lie. That's when Emma appeared in the doorway, radiant and slightly breathless from holding court in the living room. She moved toward us with the kind of confidence that comes from never doubting you're the most important person in any room. "There you are," she said to David, slipping her arm through his. "Everyone's asking where the groom disappeared to." Then she noticed me, really noticed me, for what felt like the first time all evening. "Oh good, you two met. David, this is my sister. She's a doctor, but she's so modest about it. Never wants to talk about her work." The casual dismissal hit me like a slap. Never wants to talk about her work. Like my silence was a character flaw instead of a survival mechanism. Like my refusal to perform my accomplishments was the same thing as not having any. "Actually," David said, his voice carrying a weight that made both Emma and me look at him more carefully, "your sister and I have met before, professionally." Emma's smile flickered for just a moment. Not with jealousy or suspicion, but with genuine confusion. Like she couldn't quite process the idea that someone in her orbit might have a connection to me that didn't run through her first. "Oh," she said, recovering quickly. "That's nice. Small world, right?" But David wasn't looking at Emma anymore. He was looking at me, and his expression was serious in a way that made my chest feel tight. "Dr. Chen," he said, using my title again, making it sound important, making it sound real. "Would you mind if I asked you a question about your work?" Everything stopped. Not just the conversation, but the entire world. Because in 28 years of family gatherings, no one had ever asked me a question about my work. Not a real question, not a question that suggested they actually wanted to hear the answer. Emma was still holding David's arm, but I could feel her confusion growing. This wasn't how these conversations usually went. Usually, people asked her about her photography, her travels, her plans. They asked me about whether I was dating anyone or when I was going to buy a house, or if I ever got tired of all that blood. "What kind of question?" I asked. The kind that might take a while to answer properly. And that's when I realized what was happening. David wasn't just making conversation. He was creating space for me to exist in my own right, space for my voice to be heard, space for my expertise to matter. It was the kind of space my family had never thought to create. Emma must have sensed the shift because she tightened her grip on David's arm, not possessively, exactly, but with the subtle tension of someone who wasn't used to sharing the spotlight. "We should probably get back to the party," she said. "Everyone's waiting for us to cut the cake." "In a minute," David said gently. "I really would like to hear about Dr. Chen's work first." The way he kept using my title felt deliberate, like he was reminding everyone in the room, including me, that I had an identity beyond my relationship to Emma, that I had accomplished things worth discussing, that I deserved the same respect and attention that everyone automatically gave to my sister. It should have felt like a gift. Instead, it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. Because once you start talking about who you really are, once you stop hiding behind the comfortable fiction of being unremarkable, you can't take it back. Once people see you clearly, they also see clearly when you disappoint them. But David was waiting, Emma was waiting, and somewhere in the living room, 40 people were probably wondering where the happy couple had disappeared to. I opened my mouth to give him the short version, the cocktail party version, the version that would satisfy his curiosity, without revealing too much about the weight I carried every day. Instead, I heard myself say something I'd never said out loud at a family gathering. Trauma surgery isn't like what you see on TV. It's not dramatic or exciting. Most of the time, it's just trying to solve puzzles while someone bleeds out on your table. You're working with incomplete information, impossible timeframes, and the knowledge that every decision you make could be the difference between someone going home to their family or never seeing them again. The words came out steady, matter of fact, but underneath them was something I'd been carrying for years. The weight of every patient I'd saved and every patient I'd lost. The exhaustion of making life and death decisions, while my family worried about whether I was getting enough fiber in my diet. "When your father came in," I continued, looking directly at David, "he was technically dead twice on the table. His heart stopped, and we got it going again. Then it stopped again, and we got it going again. But the third time, when it stopped for almost 4 minutes, everyone in the OR started looking at me like I was supposed to have an answer I didn't have." Emma shifted beside David, but I couldn't stop now. The words were coming from a place I'd kept locked up for so long that opening it felt like releasing pressure from a dam. So I made a call that wasn't in any textbook. I tried a technique I'd only read about in journals, something experimental, something that could have killed him if I was wrong. And for about 30 seconds while I was working, I was the only person in that room who believed it was going to work. The kitchen had gone completely silent. Even the sounds from the party seemed to fade into background noise. But it did work. His heart started beating again, and this time it stayed beating. And when I finally walked out of that OR 14 hours later, I knew I'd just lived through the best day of my career and the most terrifying day of my life all at once. I looked at David, saw the recognition in his eyes, the understanding that came from knowing how close his father had come to dying. "That's what I do," I said simply. "I fix people who are broken. I bring people back from the edge of dying. I save lives." The words hung in the air like smoke. I'd never said them like that before, never claimed that space, never owned the magnitude of what I did for a living. And in the silence that followed, something shifted. Something fundamental and irreversible. Because Emma was staring at me like she'd never seen me before. Like she was realizing that the quiet sister she'd always known, the one who hung up coats and passed appetizers and never made a fuss, was actually someone extraordinary. Someone who held other people's lives in her hands every day and made it look effortless. David nodded slowly, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with something that sounded like gratitude and grief mixed together. "Thank you," he said, "for my father, for your work, for everything." And that's when Emma finally understood why her fiancé had been so eager to find me in the kitchen, why he'd used my title like it mattered, why he'd created space for me to talk about my work when no one else ever had. It wasn't about being polite to the groom's family connections. It wasn't about making conversation at a party. It was about recognizing someone who had earned recognition. Someone who deserved to be seen and heard and valued for who they actually were, not who they were in relation to everyone else. The realization was written all over Emma's face. And underneath the surprise and the dawning awareness, I caught a glimpse of something that looked almost like shame, because she was finally understanding what I'd known for years. That her little sister, the one she'd always thought was shy, unremarkable, content to live in the background, was actually living a life of profound meaning and impact, while she'd been too busy performing to notice. From the living room, someone called Emma's name. The party was waiting for its star to return. But for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the supporting character in someone else's story. I felt like the protagonist of my own. Emma hesitated for a moment, clearly torn between her obligations as the guest of honor and this new understanding of who her sister actually was. David solved the dilemma by gently extracting his arm from hers. "Go ahead," he told her. "I'll be there in a minute." She left reluctantly, glancing back at us as she walked toward the living room. I watched her go and felt something I'd never felt before at a family gathering. I felt important. "I need to ask you something," David said once Emma was out of earshot. I braced myself for the question I'd been dreading since he'd first recognized me. The question about why I'd never mentioned our connection to Emma, why I'd never told my family about saving his father's life, why I kept my work so separate from my personal life. Instead, he asked something completely different. "Are you happy?" The question caught me so off guard that I actually laughed. Not with humor, but with the kind of bitter recognition that comes when someone finally asks the thing you've been asking yourself for years. What kind of question is that? The kind that matters more than any of the other ones. I looked through the doorway at the party still happening in the next room. Emma was back in her element, surrounded by admirers, glowing with the kind of confidence that comes from never doubting your place in the world. My parents were beaming as they watched their golden daughter hold court. Everyone was laughing and drinking and celebrating the beautiful future that stretched out ahead of the perfect couple. "I'm good at what I do," I said finally. "I'm successful. I save lives. I make a difference." "That's not what I asked." He was right. It wasn't. And the fact that I couldn't answer his actual question told us both everything we needed to know. Because the truth was, I'd spent so many years trying to prove my worth to people who'd never bothered to question it, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to just be, to exist without justification, to matter without having to earn it every single day. I'd built a life around being excellent at something my family couldn't understand or diminish, and in the process, I'd made myself excellent at being alone. "I don't know," I said, and the honesty of it felt like stepping off a cliff. "I don't know if I'm happy. I don't know if I've ever really thought about it." David nodded like this was exactly the answer he'd expected. "You should think about it," he said gently. "You should think about what would make you happy, separate from what you think would make everyone else proud." And then he did something that completely undid me. He smiled, not with pity or condescension, or the kind of patronizing warmth people usually reserved for the family member who tried too hard. He smiled like he saw me, really saw me. Like he understood that the woman standing in front of him was someone worth knowing, worth valuing, worth more than the small space she'd been given in other people's lives. "I'm glad we got to talk," he said. "Really talk. Emma's lucky to have you as a sister." He paused, then added something that hit me like lightning. "I just hope she knows that." Then he walked back toward the party, leaving me standing alone in the kitchen with the weight of everything that had just happened settling into my bones. Because David was wrong about one thing. Emma wasn't lucky to have me as a sister. I was the one who'd been lucky enough to finally be seen. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced smiles and careful conversations. I watched Emma and David cut their engagement cake, listened to toasts about their bright future, helped clean up glasses and plates like I always did. But something fundamental had shifted. Every time someone introduced me as Emma's sister, I felt the words differently, not as a definition, but as an incomplete description. Every time someone asked what I did for a living and then changed the subject before I could really answer, I noticed the dismissal in a way I'd trained myself not to before. And every time I caught David watching me from across the room, I felt a little less invisible. When the last guest left and the living room was finally quiet, Emma found me in the kitchen, finishing the dishes. "That was nice," she said, leaning against the counter. "What David said about meeting you before, you never mentioned that. You never asked." The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but I didn't take them back. Because it was true. In all the months Emma had been dating David, in all the stories she'd told about his family and his job and his childhood, she'd never once asked if I might know him, never once considered that his world and mine might overlap in meaningful ways. "I ask about your work all the time," Emma said, but there was uncertainty in her voice. "You ask if work is going well. That's different than asking about my work." She was quiet for a moment, processing this distinction. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller. "What else don't I know about you?" It was such a simple question, such an obvious question. the kind of question that should have been asked years ago by parents or siblings or friends who cared enough to look beyond the surface of someone they claimed to love. But it was also the kind of question that required an honest answer, and I wasn't sure either of us was ready for that level of honesty. "I don't know, Em. What do you want to know?" "Everything," she said quickly. "I want to know everything. I want to know about your patients and your research, and why you became a surgeon, and what it feels like to save someone's life, and why you never talk about any of it at family dinners." The eagerness in her voice should have felt good. It didn't. It felt like too little, too late. Because where was this curiosity when I was applying to medical school? Where was this interest when I was working 100-hour weeks as a resident? Where were these questions when I was struggling to find my place in a world that seemed designed for people who looked and sounded nothing like me? "You really want to know?" I asked. "Yes." I became a surgeon because I was tired of feeling powerless. I specialize in trauma because broken things make sense to me in a way that whole things never have. I don't talk about my work at family dinners because no one ever seems interested. And I got tired of performing my accomplishments for people who'd already decided I wasn't that interesting to begin with. Emma flinched like I'd slapped her. "That's not fair. We've always been proud of you." Proud is different than interested. You can be proud of someone without actually seeing them. The truth of it hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we wanted to cross. "I see you," Emma said quietly. "Do you? Can you tell me the name of the hospital where I work? Can you tell me what kind of surgery I specialize in? Can you tell me about a single patient I've treated or a single research project I've worked on?" The silence that followed was answer enough. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I didn't realize." "That's just it, Em. You didn't realize because you didn't look. And you didn't look because you didn't think there was anything worth seeing." I turned to face her fully, and for the first time in years I let her see my anger. Not the polite frustration of someone who felt overlooked, but the deep, burning rage of someone who'd spent decades making herself small enough to fit into other people's comfort zones. Do you know what it's like to save someone's life and have nobody to tell about it? Do you know what it's like to come home from the hardest day of your career and have your family ask if you remembered to record their favorite TV show? I didn't know you wanted to tell us about it. I shouldn't have to want it. You should have wanted to hear it. That's what people who love each other do. They ask questions. They show interest. They make space for each other to be whole, complicated human beings, instead of just the roles they play in family photos. Emma was crying now, but I couldn't stop. The words had been building pressure for so long that releasing them felt like finally being able to breathe. "You want to know why I never talk about my work? Because the one time I tried to explain what I do, Dad made a joke about malpractice insurance. The one time I mentioned a patient who died on my table, Mom changed the subject to ask if I'd been eating enough vegetables. The one time I tried to share something I was excited about, you started talking about your photography project before I finished my sentence. I don't remember that." "Of course you don't, because it wasn't important to you. None of it was important to you." Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her carefully applied makeup. "What can I do? How can I fix this?" And that was so typical, so perfectly Emma. the assumption that everything could be fixed with the right gesture, the right apology, the right amount of attention applied at the right moment. You can't fix 28 years of not seeing me by suddenly deciding you want to look. So that's it? I'm just supposed to accept that I'm a terrible sister and you hate our family? I don't hate our family. I hate feeling invisible in my own life. I hate having to earn basic recognition for extraordinary work. I hate that it took your fiancé recognizing me from the hospital for anyone in this house to think I might have something interesting to say. The fight went out of Emma all at once. She slumped against the counter like she'd been deflated. I don't know how to be different, she said. I don't know how to undo all of this. You don't undo it. You do better going forward. How? You ask questions. You listen to answers. You remember that I exist even when I'm not standing right in front of you. We stood in the kitchen for a long moment, surrounded by the debris of a successful party, both of us trying to figure out how to move forward from a conversation that had changed everything. Finally, Emma spoke. Tell me about your work right now. Tell me something you've wanted to share but never had the chance to. It was a start, a small one, maybe too small, but a start nonetheless. So I told her about the research I was doing on minimally invasive surgical techniques. I told her about the patient I'd operated on last week, who reminded me of our grandmother. I told her about the medical conference I was presenting at next month, the one I'd been nervous about mentioning because I assumed no one would care. And Emma listened, really listened, asked follow-up questions and remembered details, and responded with the kind of engaged curiosity that made me understand why David had fallen in love with her. It wasn't enough to undo decades of feeling unseen. It wasn't enough to heal the hurt of growing up in the shadow of someone who shone so brightly that everyone else seemed dim by comparison. But it was enough to make me think that maybe, possibly, things could be different. When I finally left the party that night, I drove home through empty streets, thinking about David's question. Was I happy? I still didn't have a clear answer, but for the first time in years, I felt like it was a question worth exploring. Because maybe happiness wasn't about being seen by other people. Maybe it was about seeing yourself clearly enough to know what you needed and brave enough to ask for it. I didn't hide who I was. I just stopped shrinking it to fit other people's comfort. And if you've ever been underestimated because you didn't announce yourself, if you've ever felt invisible in your own life, if you've ever wondered whether the people who claim to love you actually see you at all, you already know how this feels. You already know that the moment someone finally recognizes you for who you really are, it changes everything. Not because it makes you different, but because it reminds you that you were always worth seeing. You just had to stop waiting for permission to be seen.